a few years now we've been in conversation. And then, of course, more specifically about the piece that you've made here for Laumeier Sculpture Park.
In the most recent body of works that I call Metamorphoses, including the work for Laumeier. It's inspired by the myth of Daphne, and so it is about the violence against women and the beauty and the horror of that myth and this very moment in which Daphne decides to recreate herself as a tree, to be reborn, basically. And there is a beautiful promise, kind of an ecofeminist context, that I very much feel affiliated with, as an artist, as an ecofeminist artist, but also something that our culture has forgotten about, which is that it is also a story about death and trauma.
Building on what you've just said about, and then providing the context in terms of the concepts and themes that run through your work, especially the one that you've created for us here as our visiting artists in residence, and our Kranzberg exhibition artists for 2024. The way you interweave sculpture, sound, performance is powerful and it is unique. Can you tell us about your process for developing metamorphosis sound sculpture?
The work is site specific to the myth, but also site specific to the park. A large scale park that kind of feels almost like a forest creates conditions of kind of timelessness. Really happy when we found this specific location for Metamorphoses in the forest like area, very much on the periphery near a creek, as if it could be, a place that existed forever and never changed. And so there is a seclusion and a space where the sound that the sculpture emits can be heard almost as if you were alone with it in the world.
I just wanted to build on what you said there about finding that site and us sort of scanning the park and looking for an area that is the perfect space to encapsulate the object, but to encapsulate the concepts as well. And I think I know so much about what I do here is my relationship to the landscape. And I think when we're having conversations and we're looking for sites and we're thinking about what does this sculpture mean here? How would it be perceived here and experienced here? It really goes directly to the mission of the organization, which is to engage the community through art and nature. And it is that collaborative relationship with art and nature, and that's just the perfect example of it.
The important part of the process, as you know, was the composing of the sound, which I began already several years ago, actually. The music part of the sculpture is 35 minutes in duration, and it's composed in 6 movements. The first 4 movements I actually finished already a couple of years ago, and they are based on my piano improvisations. Soon after the pandemic began, actually, I was kind of locked in my Brooklyn studio and basically with the piano. And from those recordings, the first 4 movements are transformed into an ambisonic environment. You don't really hear the piano anymore because I layered hundreds of recordings together. So there is this kind of intensity of sound. Fifth movement, which I composed a bit later, a year or two later, is for 8 voices. So the human voice comes in kind of almost like a surprise. And then the last 6 movement was commissioned by Laumeier Park is very much going sort of back to the original idea of the women and her transformation into a tree. And it's composed for 2 female sopranos, local sopranos here. Bayers and in Piazza. I recorded them separately, combined them together in post-production, together with what seems to be drums, but it's actually my bare hands hitting the sculptures. The piece is composed of 2 columns cast in steel, which are kind of a bit taller than human beings, but very much, I think, evoking both a human presence and a tree. You know?
Right.
From those 2 columns, we hear the sound arriving several times during the day.
My next question, really, we talked about, because we were talking about the site for the work. And my question really was about, what aspect of the park sparked your imagination at the beginning of our working together. It kind of turned into a newer version or a second version of a piece that already exists and is in a park in Poland and Oransko.
Yes.
These 2 pieces are connected, or how this work was derived from something you had already been working on.
I feel that those 2 pieces are sisters also in the sense that they are connected by the music. The music is the same, but also connected by a kind of idea of, maybe having many of them one day, or more than 2 projects in parks around the world where they communicate through the ocean,
And it really does feel that way.
As you know, I was very firm about this idea that I don't want the sound to be triggered by human presence, but rather I want it to be, and it is in both instances, something that is the rhythm of the sculpture itself. It has its own life, and the silences, long periods of silence between, are as important to me for those 2 sister projects, as is the sound composition.
Right. And I think just to add to that, they're a very deliberate decision to time the sound as well. And the timing of when the sound activates for the work is deliberate in the course of the day.
Yes.
And that was one thing that you talked about, is that going back to metamorphosis and that idea of transition, is that these times are marks of the transition in the daily cycle as well.
The idea of time that we live in a sort of quotidian way, the everyday way, is not really a sensation that we have. I think as an artist, I try to bring our attention to time, the minute differences, but also the cycle of time. So those organic changes of time kind of correspond beautifully with this idea of time as a historical sequence, yes?
Right.
And lift your head again to look at the sky as deep as you can, as up as you can. That's wonderful. That's beautiful. I was filming recently performers, dancers, and weather already changed, and both in Poland and here. The piece in Poland is cast in iron, so it has a slightly different feeling in terms of its surface and color. In both cases, the piece will change. The trees change, we change, our skin changes. That's very much part of it. It's all very deliberate.
Yes. And then maybe going back to just to kind of set the stage for what a visitor that would come to encounter your work would experience, and just talk a little bit more about that, creating the sort of mysterious environment and finding that site. And going back to just describing the piece, the piece in Aransko has one column, whereas the one here has two. If we could maybe talk a little bit about the significance of having those two columns, because my experience of it is as these two objects, these two people are having a conversation.
I chose a location with the curator, Mariusz Andrzejczyk, very carefully as well. And there's a beautiful opening between the trees there, which are a little bigger than here. A similar gesture of the trees happens in the park here, where the trees are kind of making this natural cathedral,
Right.
protecting the sound from leaking too much outside of that area. But it's also visually that the pieces or the piece are protected, kind of like adopted,
Right.
by,
It's embraced.
by the trees, yes.
The urge to do that is to embrace these columns because they are very figural, but because of the material they're created with, there's an armor there. So it's almost like there's a contradiction in wanting to embrace this very cold material. But it's also very soft at the same time. So I like that about it, that there's a dichotomy about what you see and what you feel and what it actually is.
Because, when I was first working on this project with the piano improvisations and then a cycle of drawings, I was imagining how it would sound and look if my own skin turned into a tree bark. What would be sonic representation of that transformation? Because there's, a hardening happening, yes, in that decision to defend yourself from violence. So first you harden into a tree bark, and then ultimately you harden into an armor. You become a warrior.
Right. Definitely. And I think the surface, as you mentioned, it does change, and it will patina over time. And I think it will create some of that softness too. And it represents time in that sense as well. Well, I guess I wanted to maybe move on to the different ways that you have activated the work through these various performances. We began with the performance at the opening of the work, but then have been doing a related project and then one here on site here at Laumeier Sculpture Park with the vocalists, with the dancers. Can we talk a little bit about your decisions to activate the space and what that means?
The one here I thought of as a river of sound and movement. So the performers were standing on the trail. They were facing the trees because I wanted very much for both the performers and the witnesses, meaning the audience, to understand that the singing and the dancing was a very minimal dancing, the gestures of lamentation were for the nature and towards the nature rather than as a form of entertainment for an audience of people.
Right.
And a similar thing happened, as you mentioned. I did a associated project at the Sax Museum. But what connects the two is this idea of a sonic and choreography-based landscape that the audience is invited to walk through or to experience, but as witnesses rather than as consumers. Audience was not allowed in until the group was already, the ensemble was already well into the performance. I wanted to create conditions for heightened emotion for each of the individuals who joined me. And for that, I needed for the space to be completely clean of any, external visitors or witnesses until everybody was so much, in this that basically it was okay for others to come because it didn't matter anymore.
Right. I think some of it's my need to activate the spaces that way too, because so much of what people usually experience in the park are these static objects. They're coming here, but their senses are heightened by the nature around it or even the other people around it. And I know there's so many kinds of artworks out here as far as materials, concepts, themes, ideas. So it's a lot, but I like to activate the spaces in different ways, and sound is one way to do that. And I think going back to something you said at the very beginning is this combination of both the sound but also the silence. And I think that was one of the first things that I experienced when you played your work for the first time, and then we had it all installed, and it made me kind of go deeper into and let myself hear all of the other things when the work wasn't on, right? So I sat there with it without the sound. So my hope for that, for the piece and for our visitors, is to have those different experiences and just allow themselves to sit with them.
One of the most amazing things about making a project for a park is that it's a sonic universe, it's a symphony. I've heard that before, sometimes from people who witnessed my work, that they heard the world a little bit differently afterwards, that they listened.
Yeah.
And of course, we also have birds, and then there's this amazing whistling happening, with the leaves now, and it's just everything is all the time sonically activated. So there is no silence, of course, as we know.
Right.
My performers have expressed to me how happy they were to be able to contribute to my vision to come to life. Yes, they take my composition and they are allowed to choose a passage to memorize from it.
Okay.
And then they repeat and sing it at in their own natural rhythm. So the piece that I did here will be forever, unique. Both pieces I did because they are based on each of the individuals choosing where to sing,
Right.
when to be silent, and coming in and out like an ocean or like a wave of presence. Yes.
Right.
So much of my work is about creating conditions for emotion to occur. When you really are there, profoundly grounded and in the moment, and you think about the earth and the ground and your body and your feeling, yes, very often it creates emotions, even in my performance. So what you receive as a viewer, as an experiencer of my work, is real.
Right. No, I totally agree. In all of those performances, I felt as a witness, also as a viewer, I could feel that too, even though maybe I wasn't part of that choreography as far as the organization of it, but I felt part of it at just being there. And so I think maybe to wrap up, and we did talk a little bit about this, but what is your hope for a visitor coming to Laumeier Sculpture Park and seeing and experiencing Metamorphosis sound sculpture? What do you hope their takeaway is, or what do you hope their experience is, or what they'll understand of your work and of this piece?
For somebody to spend more time with the piece on location, I hope that the feeling will be very similar to the feeling that we have when we experience music that we like. But at the same time, because it's such a physical place and you're surrounded by nature, I hope that it will produce a sense of wonder, but also asking yourself, or think on a more meta level. I hope that this work and this entire body of works can produce a feeling and an emotion that can then be kind of almost like a potential for another form of transformation or metamorphosis, the cultural one.
Right.
Collectively, we can revise that mythological trope, which is part of larger culture that is permitting violence against women, and that is an ongoing problem around the world, not just specific to any particular geography or time.
Right. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very powerful piece. So thank you so much.
Thank you.